In this video, you will discover 4 easy ways to increase the discoverability for your podcast. So look, my name is Anthony Winery. I'm the co-founder of GetMoreListeners.com, a company helping entrepreneurs with podcasts turn a slow growth show into a rapidly growing positive ROI show. Over the last 4 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters, and I'm also the co-host of Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing, which generates around $10,000 of attributed sales each and every month. Those right there are our best-selling books, Underpenning with Daniel Larson. So if you're familiar with those books, now you know where they came from. But again, this isn't about me, it's about you. So with that being said, let's dive straight in. Number 1, change the name of your podcast to be clear and more specific. Now, look, I'm going to be honest, this one sounds a bit too obvious. Sound like change the name of your podcast. How the hell is that going to help you increase the discoverability or help you get more listeners for your show? So here's the thing. Yes, I am genuinely being serious and suggesting that you change your show name if it's not clear or specific. An example of a recent client we helped do this for was a client called Ben. And the before and after is simply this. So for Ben, his podcast before was all about break the change from the 9 to 5, which is relatively broad, unspecific, and super unclear in terms of what the show is about, who the show is for, and why people should listen. There was no benefit. There was nothing really selling the show. So we changed the new show name to Toolkit Talks for Electricians, how to save time and make more money. Again, super clear, super specific. We know who the show's for, electricians. We know what they're going to gain, save time and make more money. For you, ask yourself, is my title broad and generic? Could I be way more specific about who the show is for and what value they're going to gain from listening to my podcast? And if that's the case, maybe it's time to switch things up to be way more specific and clear. Now, imagine you have 100 people who just discover your podcast, either on social media or a different platform, and you have an unclear name. People are constantly being exposed to your show, but whether or not they decide to click and listen comes down to one of those factors being your show name. Do they feel like it's resonating with them? Do they feel like the podcast is really for them? So change your show name will help you become more effective when it comes to promoting on social media. It will help you when it comes to being discovered by new listeners who might come across your podcast on Apple or Spotify. It will help you when you're promoting your show, when you're guesting on other people's podcasts. And it will be far more attractive when you invite high-profile guests on and their audience are now attracted to your show name because it's speaking again to them and it's clarified. The second thing you can do is find online communities where your audience hang out. For example, this could be Facebook groups, Reddit threads, Instagram pages. The whole point here is to post engaging content around the topic your show is all about. But again, do not promote. Your goal here is to simply provide value. I'm going to say this again. Under zero circumstance should you find these groups and promote. That is not the goal. The goal here, again, is to provide value and then to reach out to everyone who liked or comments and engages with you, and you're really trying to offer your podcast as an additional resource they can use to further engage with you and your content. Now, most of our clients will have a VA or a team member or a social media manager take this off their plate because they just don't have the time for it. But as an easy way of increasing the discoverability of your podcast, by again leveraging these communities, and as an easy task to repeat and delegate to someone else who has the time to invest in the strategy because, again, it's repeatable and it works exceptionally well. And the best thing about this is you can feel fully 100% confident that this is working for you because you're going to get responses like this. So these are responses that I've gotten within my profile when I've applied this exact same strategy. And when I say me, I really mean my executive assistant, Rochelle. She's an absolute superstar. Anyways, she goes into communities, provides value, and then reaches out to members who engage with our content and shares a specific podcast episode. And the best part about this is I know this absolutely works because I get responses like this. Literally saying, thanks, I was actually looking for a podcast about growing a podcast. And again, my podcast is all about growing podcasts, why your podcast isn't growing. Another one says, yes, you can share an episode with me. Another one, hey, Anthony, hope you're doing well. Yes, please share. I'll be happy to listen. Thanks. And this, again, is a way that you know you're increasing the discoverability of your show, targeting a community who didn't know about you before, but who are your target audience, providing value, reaching out. And then again, you get these positive responses. And that is how you increase the discoverability of your show, leveraging online communities. So yes, it's really that simple. And it's also extremely effective. It works. So try it for yourself because this is one of the easiest ways to turn more strangers online into active listeners of your podcast. Now on to number 3, optimize your podcast for podcast SEO. Podcast SEO is simply the process of having your podcast rank higher on Apple and Spotify. Those are the main platforms that new listeners go to when trying to discover a new show to listen to. So when you can optimize your show for Apple and Spotify to rank highly on these platforms, again, listeners are actively going to these platforms to find content. And when you're ranking for the right keywords, you're automatically increasing the discovery points for your show. You're being found organically by the listeners who are actively searching for your content. So ask yourself, what are the main keywords your listeners are searching in on Apple and Spotify to find a podcast like yours? Have these keywords, whether that's, podcasting, how to grow a podcast, entrepreneurs of podcasts, content marketing. Again, these are maybe some of my keywords. Have these keywords and search terms in your show name, in your episode title, and in your show notes. The more places you can add these specific keywords means you're giving data to Apple and Spotify on what keywords, search terms to rank your podcast for. So because you've done this, your podcast will now be shown to the right listeners who are searching for your content. And the best part is, again, these are high intent listeners. Compare this to trying to promote on social media when you're trying to convince people who are on the platforms to find cat videos, engage with friends, and a bit of drama. I like a bit of drama here and there, not too much drama. I don't get myself into much drama, but you get the point. Most of the time when someone's gone onto social media trying to be distracted, they're trying to have a quick dopamine hit, or they're trying to consume short form content. Whereas when we meet someone when they're searching on Apple and Spotify, because you're ranking higher through podcast SEO for the right keywords, these are listeners who are actively searching for your content. So it's so much easier to turn these members into active listeners of your show. And here's the thing, when you're not optimized for podcast SEO, new listeners can't find your podcast organically. It's so much harder. You're stuck trying to convince strangers on social media, people on social media who just don't simply care. Or you could simply show up where your listeners are. Again, the choice is completely yours. And then finally, number 4, guest on other people's podcasts. This is such an easy way to shortcut your way into a bigger audience. You're able to create an additional discovery point to new listeners. And because everyone's podcast audience is different, i.e. the shows you're going to feature on, they don't all have the same audience, that these are different listeners, you're consistently being exposed to hundreds, if not thousands, of new active podcast listeners each and every week. Now, think about how powerful that is. Most people are trying to convince, again, people on social media by promoting, whereas you can just guest on other people's podcasts, you feature, have the spotlight on you, build your credibility, build your authority, but more importantly, because you have a podcast that's clear, that's specific, a podcast is ranking higher in Apple and Spotify. When you guest on these shows, you're being exposed to new listeners. And the more shows you guest on, the more discovery points you have. Because if you imagine all of these different podcasts as discovery points, the more of those shows you guest on where you have an alignment of audiences, again, the more discovery points new listeners have to discover your show. You being a guest on a different podcast, you providing value, sharing your insights, and then they want to learn more about you. So where do they go to? Apple and Spotify. And they easily found you through those platforms. So to recap, here are the 4 ways to increase the discoverability of your podcast. Number 1, change the name of your podcast to be clear and more specific. Doing this will increase the conversion rate of new listeners who discover your podcast either through Apple, social media, or just guesting. And it will allow them to identify and qualify themselves for being a listener of your show. Think about it. If you had a podcast just titled with something like, relationship advice for men, versus be the guy she brags about. The show name matters so much. If you can clearly communicate what's different, what's unique, and value and benefit for your listeners, you're going to convert more strangers into listeners. Number 2, find online communities where your listeners hang out. Share valuable content, reach out to them directly, or get a team member to reach out to them directly, and send them a specific podcast episode based on their previous interactions. You can delegate this process to a team member, but again, you're increasing the discovery point, becoming an MVP, a most valuable player within these communities. Number 3, optimize your show for podcast SEO. This is one that so many podcasters miss, and I don't want you to miss out on it as well, because the growth you can gain from ranking high for the right search terms is massive. You're targeting listeners who are already searching for your content, and you're ranking high on the platforms your audience are actively going to discover new shows. And finally, guest on other people's podcasts. You feature as a guest on other people's podcasts. The more shows you guest on, the more discovery points you create for new listeners to discovering you and your podcast. So look, there you have it. That's 4 easy ways that you can start using, increasing the discoverability of your podcast starting today. Look, you have been absolutely fantastic. If you enjoyed this, you want to learn more about how we grow podcasts, click the first link down below. And if you enjoyed this video, feel free to binge our entire back catalog, because again, we've got the juice. We're giving you countless, unbelievable amounts of value. So again, if you're looking to grow fast, get big and monetize as soon as possible whilst making a ton of money and impact, binge the content, take action, implement, see the results. I'll catch you guys in a bit.